Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Not D&D. As always, I'm your host Jessica from EN World Live, and with me this week we have Nick joining us. Nick, thanks so much for joining.
Hello, thank you for having me on.
So this week we are talking about Colostle, which is a solo TTRPG adventure. If you're watching live and have any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll happily answer them during the show. And if you're listening to the podcast, any links that we talk about we'll put in the show notes, so you can just click through on there. But Nick, before we get started talking about Colostle and the game, I always like to dive into your background and history with games. So to dive into that, I'll ask the question I always ask, which is, what was the first tabletop role-playing game that you remember playing?
That's a really good question, because it was not an official tabletop RPG, I suppose.
Okay.
Thinking about it,
All
when
right.
I was like between the ages of like maybe 8 to 14, kind of, me and my brother would kind of make mazes with like puzzles and like and things to solve and things for each other. So I would draw a maze and I'd have monsters in it and puzzles and rooms and things like that, and maybe a boss at the end or whatever. And then we'd have some dice, but we wouldn't really know what we were doing with those.
But they were there.
They were there. Yeah. They were definitely there. Yeah, maybe they were a paperweight. I don't know. And there would be this sort of like idea that I would essentially be the DM and he would be exploring this maze that I'd create, and it would probably take him about 15 minutes to get through, or he'd just get completely lost because it was fundamentally broken. But we had so much fun doing this, and then it would be his turn and he'd go and draw a maze or whatever, and then I'd have to go through that. And we probably picked up whatever what we thought we were doing was from somewhere. I think I read a novel once as a kid that was about kids playing RPG games and stuff.
Yeah.
And my cat has arrived.
We love cats. No worries.
This is Dashi.
Hi Dashi. Welcome to the live streaming podcast.
Very well behaved until suddenly then. But yeah, so I think I'd read about what must have probably been D&D, except I hadn't really picked up on that. And so we did this sort of proto D&D thing, which we played a lot as kids. And that sort of birthed the beginning of realizing that you can have these adventures and in your imagination, in your mind. And then it wasn't for years until I properly played a tabletop RPG, and it was D&D. That was my first introduction to it. Yes, but then subsequently I've played a couple of other systems which I've had a great fun with. I've played Urban Shadows, which is part of Apocalypse system, I believe. Yeah, and I've also played I don't know if you've heard of Worm, which is a sort of it's really cool. It's like this. I think I backed it on Kickstarter, but it was like it's like a Paleolithic fantasy. So it's like your cavemen, but there's like this rudimentary form of magic in this sort of proto world. And I don't really know why it's called Worm, actually, because there aren't really any.
I was thinking about the video game that when we were younger, Worms, which is where you like throw little mines at each other and stuff.
Yes.
I was like, is it going to be that as a role-playing game?
It's completely not like that at all.
Okay, cool.
It's I think it's called Worm because maybe there was just I get this sort of sense of like legendary saga fable kind of stuff involved with that word, but really it's sort of like it's about this sort of Paleolithic early proto man fantasy. And that was my first experience being a dungeon master, was on this brand new system, which was a 2d6 system, and it's actually super cool. It's a really interesting place to play, and I don't think enough fantasy plays around with that sort of really prehistoric kind of setting, which is really fun. And we did it actually as a little podcast that we do as part of Big Punch Studios, which is something a collective I'm a member of, which I'll talk about later. But yeah, that was my first experience DMing or GMing, I suppose, in that context. And it was great. It was really good. So I've played a few different systems, but the one I've probably sat the most in with is D&D, which I know is probably not the right thing to talk about on this podcast.
Well, no. I mean, we don't hate D&D on this. Like,
no.
I play D&D, work for EN Publishing. We made Level Up Advanced 5th edition, which is using that engine at its core. But it's just there's so many other great games, which is what we're here to talk about.
There is. That's exactly
It's so interesting you say that from the beginning, your first experience was creating like a dungeon or an experience for someone else to then kind of do on their own, because that just seems like the introduction to solo RPGs. And so for you creating that now, it makes perfect sense, because it's like where you started. So there's something nice and cyclical about that story. But talking about your background as well, because you mentioned you don't just do role-playing games, you've got Big Punch Studios, and also your background in kind of comic books. Could you talk me through kind of that and how you ended up being somebody that makes games for a living? Because a lot of people listening to this are probably thinking, I have an idea, I would love to be doing that. How do I do that? How did you do that, Nick?
Yeah, doesn't everyone say that everyone's got a book in them? Well, maybe everyone's got a game in them. I don't know.
Yeah, probably.
But well, I started out. All I've really the most focused thing I've ever really been or done is drawing. That's always been my mainline passion and love. So many other things came and went in my life, and the only thing that ever remained like truly consistent was the want to draw and the want to illustrate things and to create things. And it was so weird, because even when I was younger, I often saw it as I remember this is a weird anecdote, but I remember going to the Natural History Museum as a kid and then coming home from it and thinking, what I want to do is make my own Natural History Museum. This was usually like my whole kind of, this is like my mindset, where I see something that I really like and I'm like, I want to make my own version of that somehow.
Okay.
And so what I ended up doing was, we had loads of massive cardboard boxes because we just moved into our new house, and I just ended up lining them all up in a sort of snake and then just drawing on the inside surfaces of all of these boxes with all the exhibits of the museum. And then if you crawled through, you essentially explored this. And this anecdote has a point. Which is that basically all these different things I would try all the time, they would always boil down to, in some way or another, I would be drawing and I'd be illustrating something. Yeah. So that very much became like what I knew was my sort of thing, what was my calling in a way. Yeah. And so I ended up doing illustration at university, got a degree in illustration, and then went on to work essentially freelance, and also very much found like comics. I'd always been reading comics when I was younger. They could take me to fantastic worlds, sci-fi or fantasy. I absolutely loved them, and I thought they were a great way to build worlds. And I realized that the most consistent thing, again, with how I was applying my artwork, was always that I wanted to create worlds. That was something that seemed so consistent. I thought, what better way is there to build a world than to tell a story in it, because then it comes to life. Yeah. And comics were a great vehicle for this. So I, up until very recently, I've had a day job alongside everything I've done creatively, thankfully and incredibly, and mostly thanks to Colostle, I am now full-time doing all this cool stuff. Amazing. But back then it was very much like in my spare time, I was making comics, I was doing some freelance work, and just doing my best to sort of try and get myself out there, while at the same time doing really only what I loved. And the freelance thing didn't really gel for me, I think, because I was doing commissioned work for other people, and I more than anything, my head was just full of like these incredible weird fantasy worlds and things that I wanted to put out into the world instead. So I ended up meeting a group of like-minded people, and we formed Big Punch Studios. We all met essentially through the con scene.
Amazing.
And we created this sort of banner to self-publish our own comic books and stuff. And then the sort of growth of that scene, the comic convention scene, which is where we met and where we sold all our stuff, that grew into being so much more than Comic Con, just comics at the conventions. It was, of course, all nerdery, all geekeries, and games started to be a major part of that world. And I started meeting people who were developing their own games, and they needed illustrators to do that. And I had sort of made a little bit of a name, not a big one, but a little bit in the sort of UK indie comic scene. A few people got in contact with me, and I started doing quite a lot of sort of freelance illustration work, but on board games. And I started to realize, there's a whole thing here. Like, it's funny how I hadn't really thought about making my own games before that point, despite enjoying them. But I was sort of guided in by being hired to do this stuff, and started to realize how accessible it was and how democratic it kind of was to make games, even for us, like, one or two size teams or whatever. So that was really, really inspiring for me. And then I started just thinking, well, what if I could do that too? What if I didn't need to be just the illustrator? What if I could do the whole shebang kind of thing? I had an understanding and a care for how games were built and how they functioned. And so I thought maybe I could give it a shot. And most importantly, I think I realized that they are such a pure exercise in world building as well, and particularly RPGs. And that was when that nugget of an idea got under my skin. I realized that I've sort of gone full circle here, and I've come back around to realizing that I can build worlds in a completely different way, but still applying all the same skills that I've already built. And that basically led to Colossal being born. Colossal was going to be a comic for years and years and years. I had that title, and I had that world in my head. And I just didn't have a story. I had so much about the world, and I had like the greater lore and like what the Colossal is, how it formed, what the end of the whole story would be. I knew all of that, and I still know all of that, and that's all still true to the game I've made now. But I needed that feet on the ground, you know, characters going about their business sort of story, and I just didn't really have all of that gelled. And then I discovered solo RPGs. I realized that there's an even tighter place that I could sort of play around with an idea. And the rest is kind of like, I put it all together. I made something, and amazingly, people really, really responded to it. It was just so cool. So, yeah.
Fantastic. Well, the artwork in it is amazing. So, as you say, all done by yourself. So your skill set and background really shows through. So if you're watching the live stream, you can see the pictures on it now. And in the show notes, we'll put some links to the podcast, so you can go take a look on the website as well to see what we're talking about. What sort of inspirations were there for the art? Because very distinct art style, very beautiful, epic, big worlds, and really magical, and also a bit weird because of the idea of the setting. There's something a bit mysterious about it and grand. So yeah, what was the inspiration for your art references in this?
Well, thank you. That it's very complimentary. That's literally everything I was hoping to achieve with it all. So that's really cool. Lots of inspirations. I'm a huge fan of animation and video games as well. So I think my personal visual style was massively influenced by things like Studio Ghibli movies and the whole like visual sort of brightness that Legend of Zelda games bring to their adventures as well. Particularly recently with the big two, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom as well. But
I've not played the new one yet, but yes, I've heard. Yes, not a chance yet. Everyone on social media is talking about it though, because they're like, I'm playing it, it's so good, but I've missed out. But yeah, so sorry, you just panged a bit of jealousy in me there. I was like, I've played that. But yeah, carry on. Yes. Okay, so there's a reference as well.
Definitely, yeah. So it's that really colourful, bright adventure that I really really like. We've got more than our fair share of the grim, dark, gruesome, cast in shades of grey kind of fantasy, and I totally sometimes can really love that, and I think there's more than a place for that, and for some people that's their preference too. Mine's very much the opposite. Mine's very much the sort of brightly coloured. That's not to say the stakes aren't still high and the adventure is still as exciting, but I just really love a lot of colour in there, and a slight cartoony flavour as well. I think that brings characters and emotions like so much higher to life, I think, as well. Everyone isn't just a brooding vampire killer, you know, that they might be scared, or they might be afraid, or they might be, you know, jubilant or whatever. I think that could be really fun to add a lot of character to things. So my background in my sort of inspirations of my artwork wanted to reflect that ability to be able to bring characters to life, obviously doing comics and stories and things, and then that ended up worming its way, I think, into Colossal. So yeah, it's that genuinely like cartoony animated vibe that I really wanted to give it. And I think like particular illustration you just had on the screen where we've got a rook up in the clouds, that slightly Wambly Howl's Moving Castle kind of energy I really like. Yeah,
definitely comes through in that image for sure. So obviously talked about the game. It's clearly a very, very pretty game. The first time I saw it was at actually the UK Games Expo 2022, and I saw it on the stand, and I stopped to have a look because of the cover. And I think you're at the UK Games Expo again this year as well.
I am, yes, yeah.
This weekend. So if you're in the UK and going to the expo, you can go have a look in person as well. Just a little plug there. I'm also there as well, but we're not here to talk about that. Anyway, talking about the Colossal. So we've talked about your kind of art inspirations, but let's talk about the actual game and the story. Perhaps maybe is it worth, before we do the inspirations of the story, you giving like a little summary of what the game actually is, what the story is, and what the world is?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so so Colossal is a solo journaling RPG. So the core conceit really is that you create a character and you get to set out on an adventure to explore the Colossal, which is a castle that is so colossal that there are literal continents, oceans, mountains, valleys, cities within the rooms of the structure itself, and there is no outside, in inverted commas, to the Colossal. If you find a wall, if you find a door, if you find a window, even in this insanely up into the heavens wall in front of you, and then pass through that, however means you find a way, you'll find yourself in yet another room. And it seems to be infinite rooms in literally every direction, and even floors as well. There are floors above the floor you might start in. There may be a room with an ocean draining through a hole in the floor that pours a column of water down through the ceiling of a room below it. There may be a hole that allows you to look down and find yourself up in the clouds of a floor below, that sort of thing. There are rafters up in the heights of the rooms, which are shrouded in clouds, but are a place you can actually explore in the game. And yeah, and the idea is that it's your story. So the game itself is, because it's a journaling exercise, the game provides you with prompts. And the way it does this is it uses a playing card system, a standard deck of playing cards. That was a very deliberate choice because I wanted it to be very accessible to people. They might have a deck of cards kicking around at home, and then all they need to do is buy the rules. And you, depending on where you are in the game and in the adventure and in your story, you draw a number of cards according to your character's stats. And that dictates what your character discovers on that particular day of exploration. And you are then faced with prompts. So they are as simple sometimes as just ruins or a trap. And you can sort of decide to interpret that however you want. Or another character. Maybe you meet another adventurer on your travels. And you're just faced with these prompts. And then it's up to you to sew those together. That other adventurer could be a friend, or it could be a foe. The trap could be something you escape from, or you are stuck in overnight. You know, it's completely up to you how you take these. The only rule really is don't ignore any of them, because they all happen to you in this period of time. And I think what's interesting about what I hoped would be interesting, and what ended up being interesting about that, was that you will be surprised how inspired you get. That was what I really wanted. So rather than it just being, oh, I've just found ruins. Well, what are the ruins? Well, before you've even stopped to really think that sentence out loud, you're starting to think, well, what if the trap is in the ruins? What if the ruins themselves were built to be a trap? What if the whole reason I think I'm on this quest was to explore these archaeological finds, and it turns out that they're actually only there to trap me? And then suddenly you've just built this narrative in your head. And granted, I'm like, you know, I have a background in telling stories and things, and so maybe that sort of stuff comes naturally to me. But incredibly and so humblingly, I've had so many people tell me that they felt that they didn't have any imagination at all, and that they didn't have any ability to come up with this stuff, and yet they found themselves telling stories more epic than they ever hoped that they would, which is super cool. So so that was the hope, that was the dream, and that's how the game functions. And you're keeping this journal as you go. And then there are some grunchier rules in there as well. There's the combat system, which is less just you know, deciding how prompts resolve themselves, but instead there is literally stats with your character, number of attacks they can do on during a battle, and the same for opponents that you fight as well. And yeah, resolving those attacks. But then they also all have flavor as well, so you can write up the battle afterwards and tell the story of your great victory or defeat.
Oh, so, yeah, or defeat. Yes, that's very true. Yeah. Amazing. So I think some people maybe, like, I've very recently started exploring the world of kind of solo RPGs and journaling RPGs. And at first it seemed something a bit bizarre to me, because I was like, well, role-playing games feel very like social to me. It's something I do with other people. So what is it people get from like a solo RPGs and solo journaling RPGs in particular?
So that's actually a really good question, because I think this is one of the things I didn't realize I was making the game for until after I'd made it, and then I was like, this makes so much sense that I made this game. And the reason is, I think that well, firstly and most importantly, I think the answer for how role-playing works solo is literally how you write that journal. So you could decide that you are a barely literate barbarian sort of character who is sort of reluctantly keeping a journal, but maybe is only doing it because they want to leave a legacy of some kind. And so then you could write it in this very like scratchy, bullet pointy sort of way. It's like, I defeated a rook today, and I'm great, and I'm a legend. And you play the game, you play the game more to get through it, and your journal is very light. Or maybe on the other hand, you're an aspiring poet, and you think that your adventures are incredibly grand, and the joke actually at the core of the adventures are that they're actually incredibly boring. But you write about them in such an overly flowery way that you are bigging yourself up. So that's, I think, how you get some of that role-playing energy in. But I think what is quite telling about like why solo role-playing, why a fundamentally social thing, which I agree, I kind of perceived it that way. And I think, and maybe the reason that I ended up doing this was I suffer a lot from anxiety. And something that I really struggled with in the early days of role-playing was sitting at a table with loads of people who seemed way more confident than me, putting on these incredible voices and knowing exactly what their character would do in these really complex situations. And my first character I ever made in D&D, I deliberately made him incredibly naive. So he didn't know anything about the world, so that my own naivety of how to play the game would sort of come across in the character, and I could sort of play it off as
I did a very, very similar thing. So really? You saying that, so that's that spoke to me deeply,
And in the early days of playing, even for as long as like a couple of years in, and this is no reflection on the group because they were friends and they're super cool people. No one put any pressure on me, but I put a lot of pressure on myself, and I would feel a little bit anxious sometimes just going into the game. And I think the beauty of solo role playing is it gives you the opportunity to have that experience, but with no pressure at all, because it's completely up to you how much you role play or how little you do, but also you can start to learn the process of it as well. And I've had a lot of people say that they've started role playing with solo RPGs and then they've moved into multiplayer RPGs because they felt like they've got an understanding of it. Or then I've had people who've said, tabletop RPGs, multiplayer RPGs, they weren't for them, but they found that solo RPGs were, because deep inside all of us, we want to explore a fantasy world, I think, truly. But maybe not everyone feels that they can do it around a table with loads of other people looking at them. So I think there's a place for solo RPGs in a way for those people who are desperate to have the fun but struggle a little bit maybe with it. So there's that.
No, that's great to hear. And I think there's people watching now leaving comments saying they've started their Colossal journey and are adoring it. So that makes perfect sense. I hadn't thought about that, but I think a lot of people before they do role-playing games do have, it's almost like a performance anxiety, because you're like, it's like doing a amateur dramatics, like doing a play in front of people, but it's improv and I haven't, it feels, so I completely relate to that. So that's a really good angle I hadn't considered. So thank you for sharing that.
No, that's all right.
Talking about the game, so we talked about your inspiration for the artwork, but what was your inspirations for the actual kind of story and the world? Because like you said, it's this big, epic, magical, mysterious thing. Because it sounds like your character at the beginning doesn't even know how it was made or where it came from or anything like that. So that's something you'll maybe exploring in the game. Where did your inspiration come for this story?
That's a good question. I don't know in a way.
It came to you in a dream.
It came to me from somewhere. It didn't. It definitely didn't. Most of my ideas don't really arrive like complete. I don't think anyone's do, really, to be fair. But I had this idea for, I think quite often I have an idea for a title or a word sometimes first. And that can lead to inspiration. So one of my comics that I do is about a cat and a meringue who sail around in a catamaran. Of course. And I wrote that joke, that pun, if you can even call it that, before I had any idea who cat and who meringue were and what the hell they were up to on the sea and anything. I didn't know anything about them, but that name came first. Cat and meringue came first because I thought it was funny. And for all I know, actually, Colossal and the way I spell it, yes, exactly, in the sense that I spell it like the word castle, may have come to me and may have been something of a spark of an idea. Why do Colossal and castle? What does that mean? What's a truly massive castle? How big can I go? Kind of thing. And then I like to refer to rolling things around in my rock tumbler in my head. That's how the ideas evolve. And I brush off the sharp edges, the bits that don't work, the bits that get in the way and hurt other ideas, and then eventually things are smoothed down and start to work together, and then everything starts to shine. That's the kind of the analogy. And I think I got there with Colossal, with this idea of this massive structure. And then I started to have ideas about like the deep lore, which is how would a place like this even form? Has it been there since the dawn of time, or did something happen to trigger it into existence? Without spoiling anything, I can tell you that something did happen, and the Colossal was born. It wasn't there before. And then I was thinking, like, how much do you give away? You know, like, I've got all this deep lore idea now. How much do I drop in? I was like, well, I want people to tell their own stories, and maybe I want people to have their own ideas of what the Colossal is. And so I don't really want to inflict most of that deep lore in, as it were, the beginning. When I first made the first book of Colostle, I didn't have any grand aspirations for it being, even has gone on for as long as it is currently, which is just really 3 years at the moment. But it was very, very small. It was a 24-page black and white A5 little booklet, a zine, basically. That's what it was going to be. And I really just tested the waters with that and just put it out. It was very, very small, and thankfully and incredibly, like, the response to it grew it. But even then, the idea was, well, I won't say all of that big stuff, because I want people to just play the game, and who knows, I may never get a chance to say that stuff. But now, thanks to the incredible support and the love that people have shown for the game, I feel like I'm on a path now to gradually release more books as expansions, and those expansions will introduce new areas to the Colossal, and mostly and most focusedly will expand the game and make it more fun and take the players to new places. But I will also use it as a vehicle to drip feed more and more about the world. And hopefully the plan is that the way I do that is that I don't get in the way of any stories that anyone else has come up with for their grand Colossal journey. And if they've got an idea for what the Colossal is, that's cool, that's valid, that's their canon, and you can ignore my stuff. But if anyone wants to know, and I know some people do want to know the real, the official answers, I guess, then I will gradually drip feed those out. That's the plan.
Amazing. So on the screen now, we've got the kind of the original book, as it were, but there's actually 3 books. So could you talk us through the expansions for them?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So that's book 1. And that contains in it basically what I consider everything you would need to play Colossal truly, and is the ultimate experience that contains the engine, contains the base lore and the mythos of where you are and what this place is. And you could set out on an adventure, and you could play conceivably for as long as you want with just that one book.
Great.
But then as the first expansion and the second book in the series, I created the Roomlands. And the Roomlands is intended as a sort of like base book plus kind of thing. So this is like more about the base experience. So the things I add are less like incredible new places, but they're kind of variations or additional flavor on what was already in the base book. So we have stuff like what's up on the rafters. You know, every room has rafters, but I couldn't fit all of this stuff into the first book. So what's up there? How does it work with regards to different biomes, different weather, things like that? There are different kinds of rooms. So we have the tundra rooms, for example, which are these ice cold, frozen over rooms that just have a completely different survivalist kind of aspect to how you explore those. And I introduce sort of rules for that. And then the capital city of the known Roomlands, which is basically what I call the sort of like the kind of starting area where most players will begin their adventures, the known Roomlands. And the capital city there, which is Parapet. And I wanted to build a sort of like a sort of what I call a fixed location, which is where anyone who goes to Parapet, they're all going to the same Parapet. So although everyone's got their own story, they could talk to another player and say, have you been to Parapet? And they'd be like, yes. And conceivably characters could meet, you know, if they wanted them to, but if they didn't want them to, then they don't have to. It's fine. So that was the kind of stuff I wanted to nail down the rest of the sort of base book. And so in a way, Roomlands completes the full base Colossal experience with the second half of that being optional. And then the third book, which is the one that we'll get into obviously in a minute, but is currently on Kickstarter now. This is the first expansion where we literally go to somewhere completely new and explore a completely brand new part of the Colossal. And there's going to be a few more of these. I've got some more planned. But this is where this is where not only does everything change visually, but everything change mechanically as well. And I'm also trying to introduce like story arcs and stuff as well. So the key thing with Kaidina, which is book 3, is that you are exploring a sort of Eastern themed part of the Colossal. So different areas are going to behave and have different cultures and different aesthetics and styles and things. Kaidina is that Eastern theme. And the reason that I came up with these ideas is because in our world, castles look different around the world.
Yeah.
And obviously, Colossal is entirely castle themed, both from the castle itself that you're
Mhm.
exploring and also the rooks, the walking castles that you discover and fight as you're exploring. And I thought it would be so much fun to play with those aesthetic differences
Mhm.
in the game as well. So Eastern castles are radically different from ours, obviously. When I say ours, I mean like European castles.
Yeah.
And so I thought it'd be really fun to get some of that energy and aesthetic in as well. So Kayadina not only adds a whole new new exploration tables, new places to explore,
Mhm.
and these new rooks to fight, which actually have slightly different battle mechanics.
Mhm.
But it also adds a story,
Okay,
which is
yeah.
kind of optional again. But basically, there's a story of a somewhat evil empire who are ruling over Kayadina, and the assistance, and maybe the optional whether or not you help to take that empire down and put the rightful Empress back on the throne. That's the essence of the story there. So you can interact with that story as much or as little as you want, but it's happening in Kayadina as you're exploring. So
Amazing.
yeah.
So you mentioned before the game is played via a deck of playing cards, and you can just use the ones you have at home. But somebody has asked, what about all the decks? So I'm assuming this means there are some that you can get that you've made.
Yes, that's right. That's a good question, actually. Thank you, Matty C. Yeah, so there are other decks. Yeah, so the core game engine operates on a standard deck of playing cards, and that's just your usual hearts, clubs, spades, and diamonds. That's what you'd expect to see.
Sure.
But because I don't know, I just love cards, I think, and I just keep having like random ideas for this, and I just get so excited that I can't control myself. I also had the idea of introducing what I call job packs or job decks, which are an ability to have a specific job role in the Colossal, and these decks are essentially mini expansions. But rather than being an expansion that says, hey, this is a whole new area of the Colossal to explore, or hey, this is a campaign story for you to work through, this is something that just bolts onto your character rather than the world and enhances what they are able to do on a day-to-day basis. So it's kind of like seeing it like your profession or your side quest. There are 3 job decks at the moment. So there is cartographer, inventor, and researcher, nearly forgot them. And the cards are all completely unique in each of the decks. And they basically allow the function for, let's say you take cartographer, that allows your character to take on the role of being a cartographer. And that means like making maps and selling those maps in cities and towns and villages and things. So it's literally a way to have your character not just have their quest, but also have a day-to-day purpose and a way to make money as well, which, although isn't a major part of the game, could be made into a major part of your character's story potentially. Like, you know, if you don't have money, then you can't get robbed, and being robbed is kind of a fun thing in a story. So you know, stuff like that. So there are other decks, and they are again completely optional, but they are mini expansions, as I like to call them, or job decks, which add to your character's purpose in the Colossal.
Amazing. Speaking of characters, let's talk a little bit about characters and different classes. I know there's those sorts of things in the game. So when we go to create a character, what does that look like?
That looks like I tried to keep it quite light in the game because I wanted you to get playing, and stats wise, Colossal's quite light as well, because it's quite a simple way to play and get into playing the game. But basically, the way it works is you are faced with creating your character's sort of calling and nature. So the book helps you either choosing from a table or choosing at random by drawing a card, and it will give you a calling. Calling is your reason for stepping out into the Colossal. So this could be as simple as finding a relative who's gone missing, or it could be as complex as you know, taking down an evil empire or something like that. Whatever you want it to be, basically, is your calling. And the calling is an important keyword, because sometimes in exploration tables it will say you'll pull a prompt, and the prompt will be advance your calling, and it's completely up to you how you advance your calling, but that's an opportunity or a moment to have a big plot point for your character. So for example, if your calling was to find your brother who had been kidnapped and was missing, if you pulled a advance your calling prompt, you would maybe have an opportunity to find a clue as to his whereabouts, or potentially meet one of the kidnappers, or find someone who saw it happen, or something like that. And it's an opportunity to make the story evolve at sort of waypoints kind of thing. So yeah, building your calling, and then your character's nature, and that is to say what they're like. You know, are they jovial? Are they grumpy? Are they silly? That sort of thing. Build those 2 things. That's who they are. That's why they're doing what they're doing. And then we get into the classes, which is always the fun stuff in role-playing games.
Yeah.
We've got 4 classes in the base book of Colossal, and they are hinged around how your character essentially interacts with and battles in the Colossal. So everyone in the Colossal uses technology that is from harvested from a rook that they've defeated in some form or another.
Okay.
So basically, the humanity as it exists in the Colossal really is just making use of the mechanical parts they harvest from rooks that they defeat. So everything, technology, buildings, literally everything they have is that. So we have 4 classes to kick off. We have the armed, and they have a literal rook arm grafted potentially to their back or to another part of their body that allows them to have multiple arms, which is kind of always good, but also makes them, absolutely, literally in some cases.
Sorry,
but yes, but they are typically fighters, but they don't have to be. None of the classes are really locked into that necessarily, but there's kind of a leaning for each one. The followed have a rookling that accompanies them. Rooklings are little mini living castle creatures that live inside all the rooks. So when you take a rook down, a small rookling is inside. So in that picture you can see a big rook behind that potentially is threatening our hero. And then we have the helmed. They take a piece of a rook and they fashion it into something they can wear on their head, and this gives them access to the rook's magical powers that it had in life before it was defeated. And then we have the mounted, and they are kind of the inventors of this world, and they build vehicles out of rook parts. So they harvest legs, wheels, cogs, control sticks, whatever. They put those all together, and they build a way to explore and also to potentially fight as well. And the idea of all of these classes was to really give players an opportunity to just kind of run wild with what their character does. And you can, I've had people say they're mounted and they ride a bike, and it's like that's made out of cog wheels or something. And it's all made of stone, and it's fun stuff like that. And then because you can, as the game progresses, the way you kind of level up is by acquiring more. You can multi-class essentially. So you could be like, for example, you could be a followed and a mounted. And I've seen someone on the Discord for the game actually, and they have a sort of bike, and then their rookling sort of locks into their bike, kind of like R2-D2 in an X-wing kind of thing. And it's this fun stuff. I don't say anywhere in the book that that's something that they have to do or is even possible mechanically, but they can come up with that because it makes sense kind of in the way it all mechanically works. So.
Amazing. You mentioned the Discord there. I've just put a link into the chat for people watching live, and there'll be links in the show notes for the podcast as well. So if anyone wants to have a look and join on there, the link to join that Discord you mentioned is there for you.
This is really cool actually, the Discord. Like just a quick thing about that, but like there's so many people in there, and they share their artwork and they share their journals and everything. And I always point towards it as a place for people to like kind of, if they've just got Colossal or they're thinking about it, it's a great way to understand how people are playing it. And there's no better way, I think, than seeing other people playing it. And honestly, some of the artwork on there is just astonishing. Like people drawn their characters, drawn their mounts, drawn their rooklings, everything. It's just so cool. It's really, really cool. So the Discord is definitely a place to check out.
Amazing. That does lead me on to talk about, I was going to ask next, what if someone's kind of looking at the game and they want to get involved, what advice do you have for people that are going to try it out for the first time? And obviously, like you said, going to the Discord and having a look on there will be a great thing, but what other advice would you have for people, maybe if they're perhaps new to kind of solo RPGs in general? Like what advice would you give?
I would definitely say that the game, it's definitely a game at the very core of everything that it is, but it is also partly a creative writing exercise and somewhat a mindfulness one as well. And I think that's something I like to say to people when they're talking to me about whether they want to buy it or I'm selling it face to face or whatever. I like to say that because I think it's really important that they sort of understand fundamentally how this thing works. And it's like it's not like a video game. It's not like sitting around a table for D&D. There are lots of other solo RPGs like what Colossal does in that respect isn't unique, but I think it's something. It's good for people to know that there is a little bit required from them, whether it be inspiration, imagination, or even just the act of writing. I have in a very few instances, I've had a few people go, "Oh, what, I've got to write," and that's kind of put them off. And that's that's fair enough. It's not for everyone. So I think that's something that you've got to like have a love for in your heart.
But could you do like a voice recording of it if you didn't want to write?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's actually a really, really good point. There really is nothing in the rules that says it has to be pen and paper. You could, I mean, that's a really cool idea. You could say, for example, your character finds the magical ability to record sound, and that's only if you even wanted to make it like, you know, lore specific. You could just keep your diary with your voice, you know. There's absolutely, there's nothing in, and that's I think that's a really good point as well, because I don't want this to be a barrier to anyone. You know, I want anyone to be able to see themselves in this world and to be able to play this game. And obviously, if it isn't for them, then it's not for them, and that's fine. But it's like, if it even slightly is, I want them to be able to play it. So yeah, absolutely. Like, I might start saying that actually to people. This is a really good idea. I could just
it's just because I've wanted to get into solo RPGs for a while, and I'm quite dyslexic, so writing for me is just like an effort. But I was doing one, and I was like, why don't I just talk? Because that's normally how I get ideas out. And I was like, well, there's nothing to stop me doing this, and then I can record it. And then that's almost, you know, having something written is something that becomes a thing you have that can be really treasured. But then when you have an audio file of it, listening back, so if you listen to podcasts and do your stories that way, it's kind of listening back to your own little personal podcast. But
that's true. Yeah, I like that.
So that's great to hear. So you could definitely do this game that way.
And I think what would be wicked about that as well is that you would sort of be semi-training yourself to sort of think and talk in a storytelling way on the fly, which is kind of what TTRPGs ask of you as well. So if that was an angle you were going down, where you were like, I want to get used to this before I get into a group and start talking to people around a table, that could be a really good way to do that. That's a really cool idea. Yeah.
There we go. I'll put that on the community Discord when I get around to doing it then. We've questions from the live stream. So they've asked if there's any possibility of some posters for the artwork, and I don't blame them for asking, because like, the artwork is absolutely stunning.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's something I have been wanting to explore. It's just a question of like working out how, really. But I actually have that image you put up on the screen a minute ago of the girl with the rook behind her in the field. That's the one. That I actually have a huge stack of prints of that, like, ready to go, and I just haven't yet worked out logistically how I am going to ship those without them just getting, you know, tattered in the post or whatever. But no, it's really something I would like to do. And actually, I think a couple of people have asked something similar, both on the Discord and on the Kickstarter, about that being a potential reward, like posters or prints or something like that. So to hear it again makes me think people quite like that. So maybe I'll think about that for sure.
Definitely. So you mentioned people can get in touch with you, obviously via the Kickstarter or via the Discord. But it looks like somebody in the chat mentioned Patreon as well that you have. Would you like to?
Yes. The Patreon is awesome as well. Yes, so there's a dedicated group of people on the Patreon who are super generously and kindly supporting the creation of basically the future content that ends up forming the books I was talking about earlier. So everything that gets serialized on the Patreon ends up, after a fair amount of time, because books take a while to make, gets collected into books. So basically both Runelands and Kaya Diner existed previously as monthly modules. And so the way I do it is I construct the modules and thereby the book in a way that makes them sort of semi-playable as they're coming out. So it's like you're literally on the front line of exploration in the Colossal and discovering things. So
early access.
Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of like what I like to sort of think of my patrons as though they're like pioneers. They're the ones who are pushing the front lines forward. And then when they've explored these lands, we get them and we put them in a book and we give them to everyone else. And now those lands are available for everyone else to explore. So the patrons really are the guys at the front line, kind of pushing it out. And so, every month they get a brand new, usually between 5 to 10 page digital PDF module, which will have new artwork in it, and it will have new rules, and it'll just push their adventure forward a little bit. And I think a lot of them are super kind, and they're just there to support me as a creator, which is wicked cool. And then a lot of them are sort of like, they wait for a few to come out and then they like take the plunge into it. But I think some of them are literally playing them as I'm releasing them, which is really cool. So the patron is amazing, and the patrons themselves, I can't thank them enough. They're wicked.
Fantastic. And I guess the link to the Patreon account is on your website, on colossal.com.
It absolutely is. Yes.
Great.
Yes.
I'll put that in the chat and in the show notes so people can go have a look there if they are interested in being on the front line of exploring. So we're coming near to the end of our time here. Is there anything you would like to kind of share or brag about the game? Any questions I forgot to ask you about? Or
I don't think so. Well, I suppose there is one thing, and people keep telling me, Nick, you need to be less quiet about this, and you shout about it. But I'm very. This is the time. Here we go. Yeah. So this is the beginning of me getting better at this. I'm very honoured to say that I won an Ennie for Colossal.
Yes, congratulations.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so last year I was actually nominated for 6, I think it was in the end, in the 2022 Ennie Awards for the base book of Colossal, and I was in for a few categories. And incredibly, it's because I was nominated for 6, and because I was just so blown away by because the scale of that nomination, it's really quite up there with RPG awards.
Yeah,
so I decided to take a real plunge, and I flew out to Indianapolis for Gen Con for that year, because I thought, well, if I win, I'd love to be there and receive it. And then, of course, the longer I was out there, the more I realized the pressure I kind of put on myself, because I've done all of this like last minute, because you find out so late as well that you're nominated. It's like only weeks before the show, and I had to do everything so hurriedly, and so obviously the flights weren't especially cheap because I hadn't been able to book them in advance. So I'd done all this stuff, and my wife came out with me because she's amazing and has been so supportive of literally everything I do, and we were there together, and we were sitting there in the audience as things were being announced, and I was like, if I don't win anything, then what have I done? I've flown halfway around the world. And of course I shouldn't think like that, and I was constantly telling myself it's not about that, it's about being here. And I talked to loads of wicked cool people and everything. And then astonishingly, I did win gold on one of them. I won gold for rules, which is a pretty cool thing to win for, since that's kind of the whole thing of a game in many ways. So I went up and I got my medal and everything, and it was honestly just so incredible to be recognized for something that I had really poured my heart into and really made the best I could do, and I believed in it both from an artistic and writing and design perspective. I really thought I'd made something good, and then for someone to give you an award for that is just absolutely huge. And then I didn't need to, but at that point I was like, this was all worth it. I'm so glad I flew out for this and everything. So yeah, it's pretty special. And like I say, people always say, Nick, you should shout about your Ennie more, and so I should. So here we go.
Definitely should. Yeah. Well, Russ, EN World founder and owner, started up the Ennies exactly for that reason, to just give people, a platform to talk about their games and to get recognition, and for just people in the industry to say, hey, you made a really cool thing and we really like it. Because I think sometimes when you're an indie publisher, like we're all sat at home in our like offices or spare rooms or wherever, just making games, and you can feel so detached from people playing it, and
definitely,
it being a real thing. But then sometimes things like that happen, you're like, oh, it's a real thing, I did a thing and people like it. So I'm really glad you had that experience, and I really enjoyed it. I do have some final questions, because this whole show is about kind of uplifting indie games and sharing them with people. So I'm going to ask the mic to you and ask you if you have any recommendations for any games. And the rules are, it can't be D&D, because we all know about D&D, and it can't be a game that you've made. We've just spent the last hour talking about your game.
Of course, yes, of course. Yeah, well, I think I have 2 that I would like to highlight here. The first one, and I think it's very well known in solo RPG circles and everything, but it was what got me into the understanding how the engine works, and it's a game called Alone Among the Stars. Which I can't actually remember the author's name. It's a Japanese chap, I think. But it's so delightfully, incredibly simple, and it really is at the very core of it. It's just I think it's 4 pages. It's a PDF. I think it costs like $1 or something insane. And it's basically just a table for each of the suits of a deck of playing cards. And it was what inspired Colossal to be powered by playing cards as well.
Okay, great.
As a lot of solo RPGs are. And it was basically just stuff you find on your interplanetary adventures. And it's just this super gentle, and it can write as much or as little as you want. And the game hardly gives you anything at all, but it gives you just enough for it to be credited with absolutely the genius of creating an experience for a player. And yeah, it's just this little mindful keeping your ship's log as you explore planets. So that I wanted to mention that one because of its influence on Colossal. And then the other one is an amazing set of choose your own adventure books that are actually being remastered. So back in, I think it was the 80s, they were called Lone Wolf.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And they were really cool because I only played a few of them as a kid, but they had a continuity. So what you did in 1 carried over to 2 and 3, and it was this long ongoing like fantasy novel saga, but one that you played through as the hero. And it really did embody the idea that you are the hero of a story, rather than you turn left at a T-junction and you get incinerated by a flame. It was like, no, this is a story. They feel really cinematic to play, which is one of the most incredible things about them. Just the opening of the first book, and I can't remember what it's called now, so that's escaped my mind. But anyway, yeah, just look up the Lone Wolf series, and you'll see. But the opening of the first book is this cinematic experience. It's super, super cool, and they're being remastered, they're being remade, because the chap who wrote them, and I think maybe even illustrated them, can't remember now, has passed away. But his son has sort of picked up the empire and is like redoing them with new artwork and stuff. And I think they're going to be at UK Games Expo as well, which is super exciting. So yeah, that's another really good one as well.
Okay, great. Well, you can go to if you're going to the UK Games Expo this week, then you can see them there. You can also see me there at the EM Publishing stand, and also Nick there at the Colossal stand. So have a wander around and do say hi to us, and tell everybody that you heard about it on Not D&D as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And on that cheesy tagline note, I might end this week's episode. Nick, thank you so much for coming on and sharing the game with us. And congratulations on all your success with it, and on how well the current Kickstarter is going.
Thank you so much. Absolute pleasure.
And to everyone watching and listening, thank you so much for coming in and listening to the show. And if you have a link to the Kickstarter and have a look, that would be fantastic, because the best way to support indie tabletop RPG creators is to buy their stuff. And on that note, we'll leave this week. We'll be back next Monday with a different creator to tell you about a different tabletop RPG. Thanks very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.